We'd like to welcome you here to ASPER-HUJI Innovate, the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Hebrew University. I am Amnon Dekel. I'm the co-founder and executive director of ASPER-HUJI Innovate. And first of all, we want to thank everyone coming here. These are not simple days, as we know. There's a lot of issues and a lot of things happening around us, as we all know. So I think it's wonderful that we've seen all the visitors come here today. So we'd like to welcome everybody to this special event by the Halbert Centre for Cooperation, in cooperation with ASPER-HUJI Innovate. We are very, very happy and honored to have our guest, Dominic Barton, the James R. Bullock Visiting Chair in Canadian Studies, and former global managing partner at McKinsey Company. Thank you, sir, for coming today. This event is a partnership with the Halbert Centre for Canadian Studies at the Hebrew University. And before starting, we'd like to invite Professor Shaul Shenhav, Vice Dean for Engagement and Impact in the Faculty of Social Sciences, and the Director of the Halbert Centre to say a few words. Thank you.
So thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Amnon. It is truly a pleasure to collaborate with ASPER-HUJI Innovate. And I also want to thank the ASPER-HUJI team and the Halbert team. Lihi, Niva, Hanoch, Sharon, Ella. Thank you so much for all other great people that help us make this event happening, this visit happening. Thank you so much. And I want to welcome you, Dominic. And congratulations for being awarded the prestigious James Bullock Visiting Chair in Canadian Studies. The Bullock Chair visits to Israel are an important part of the Halbert Centre's mission to strengthen connections and create opportunities for collaboration between the Hebrew University and our Canadian colleagues and guests. Dominic, your visit today is deeply meaningful because you bring into this room two things that are so essential for our society: innovation and leadership. You know, the Hebrew University celebrates 100 years since its opening, and it was established by a remarkable group of intellectual giants, visionaries like Albert Einstein, Chaim Weizmann, Chaim Nachman Bialik, Martin Buber, innovators of their time, remarkable leaders. And they showed us that innovation and leadership matter at any time. But I believe they are especially important in times of hardship. That is when we really need them. Not many of you know that this visit was originally scheduled just a few weeks after October the 7th, 2023. So now you're here, Dominic, finally bringing with you the knowledge, the spirit of innovation, and bring with you your leadership. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaul. I would really be happy to invite Dominic Barton after I finish reading his bio. Okay, so be prepared. So Dominic is the chair of Rio Tinto and the chair of Leapfrog Investments, an impact investment firm focused on emerging markets. He's also a senior advisor and partner at Radical Ventures, a leading AI investment firm, and an open advisory board member of the Olayan Group, a private family-owned company. Dominic concluded his tenure as the chancellor of the University of Waterloo in 2024. Previously, Dominic was a senior partner at McKinsey Company, and then served as their global managing partner for 3 terms from 2009 to 2018. Anyone understanding that type of organization knows that that's a pretty impressive feat to get all those senior partners to vote for you. Dominic completed his role as the ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China in 2021, and he was appointed by the Right Honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2019. He was the chair of the Canadian Minister of Finance's Advisory Council on Economic Growth and was also the chair of the Seoul International Business Advisory Council in South Korea. He served as the chairman of Tech Resources and non-exclusive director at the Singtel Group in Singapore and also investor in AB Sweden. He was a senior trustee of the Brookings Institute, a member of the Singapore Economic Development Board's International Advisory Council, and a member of the boards of Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City and also of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. He is one of the founders of the FCLT Global, focusing capital on long term, and has co-authored 4 books, including Talent Wins, which was published in 2018, and is also an adjunct professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Dominic is the recipient of 8 honorary doctorates from the University of Toronto, the University of British Columbia, University of Edinburgh, among others. And he graduated from the University of British Columbia with a BA in honors in economics and has an MPhil in economics from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. What I haven't said here, I think that, were you born in Africa? You were born in Uganda. I lived in Ghana from the age of 1 to 3, so not far from there. Yeah. So Dominic, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you also to a fellow African here. But it's a real honor to be here because it's a lot of patience on a number of people's parts here because it was October the 9th. I was going to come, and when that a very tragic event occurred, and it was actually just before I went to China. It was in 2019. It was sort of about 2 months beforehand, and then I had to call up and say if something else has come up. But I'm really, really happy to be here, and just to say that from a very personal level, my heart's with you because what you're dealing with. We're in a war, and how you just keep moving ahead. I find it so inspirational. So I'm very happy to be here. It's been too long since I've been here, and I should say before, this isn't my first time in Israel. I've come a number of times. When I was at McKinsey, we would hold a lot of our global leadership sessions here. So when we've elected new partners, we would do it in Israel. And it's because of the mindset, the innovation, the leadership that's actually to inspire people in where they are. And it was also, to me, a source of innovation. So I really don't know if I'm qualified at all to be speaking here about innovation. So I'm not going to talk a huge amount about innovation. What I am going to talk about is sort of how I see the world changing. There's obviously a lot happening, but I think there's some forces, and then what that means for organizations. And innovation is a big part of that, and then how organizations can grapple with that, if that was all right. And please shut me up if I'm going too long. But at the very outset, I want to acknowledge the ASPER-HUJI Innovate initiative for having me here and hosting this, also for the Halbert Centre for Canadian Studies for actually organizing the event. I think that linkage between Canada and Israel is extremely important, and I'm very glad we're doing it at the business level as well. And also, I'm very, very excited and proud about the James R. Bullock Chair for sponsoring this overall event. So I'm grateful to that. So what I wanted to do, as I said, is just go through a bit of maybe some of the changes underway. And there's with all this kind of craziness that's going on. And I remember when I was in McKinsey and I would be giving talks to the partners or visiting with leaders, people would say, what's the context? And I'd say, this is probably the most exciting time in the last 20 years. But every year I'd sort of add another decade. And my view now is I think we're living in times that are sort of exciting from a 300-year time frame, just given the number of changes that are underway. And so I think in all this sort of volatility, there's 5 underlying forces which are like gravity that we just need to recognize. And, different things may happen in the United States. President Trump may decide to do this with the tariffs or that with the tariffs or whatever. But there are these forces that I think we need to kind of keep an eye on. The first one is just a very significant economic power shift towards Asia and Africa. And rather than blast through a pile of statistics, there's GDP numbers I can show you that, it's going to go from 42% of the world's GDP to 53%, 58% of the world's middle class is in Asia now. It's going to be the most significant growth over the next 10 years. Even China, with a declining population, will actually produce another 200 middle class people in the next 10 years. So there's just a growth. But the best way I try and look at it is if you were to put the Earth on a flat piece of paper and center of gravity from an economic point of view, in the year zero, it was somewhere near Kabul in Afghanistan, right? And then over a 2,000-year period, it basically moved to Iceland, as Western Europe and North America, and the US in particular, moved forward. But since 2000, it's moved back in the last 25 years to somewhere near Novosibirsk, right? But it's sort of the weight, and that just shows the weight. And so I think wherever we are, we have to be thinking about that region, whether you do business in that region or not, whether they're customers or not, they could be competitors or not, but they're going to be a force. And I think we don't really have the perspective that we should, given how quickly that's shifting. And I think Africa is the next wave. That's where, as we move to a 10 billion person planet, the largest bulk of the pot will be there. And again, when I think about ourselves as organizations, what are we doing to build relationships and capabilities and linkages to that part of the world? And it'll come sooner than we think. The second force is a bit related to it, which is geopolitics. And this is probably very obvious, but I'm going to come back to this on the innovation side. When I started my business career about 40 years ago, we were in what I would call peak capitalism. 1992, George Soros, a hedge fund manager, took on the Bank of England and won. And the view, a single entrepreneur could take down, basically, it didn't go back, but they defeated a central bank in terms of where it was. And the view there was, nation states, they're important, but actually the capital markets are king. You need to obey the capital markets. And it was just this view of globalization, peak capitalism. And we're in a very different stage now, I think, where it's geoeconomics. The nation state really matters. And if you don't think that's the case, you should get your head out of the sand, because it matters and it has more influence than ever in my lifetime. But a lot of leaders today grew up in that period of peak capitalism, so they're not used to dealing with this type of thing that's moving on. And we're seeing more countries, even in the United States, getting involved in business. We're seeing more government being involved in business. We're seeing, I think, more nationalism, more mercantilism. And we need to understand how that works. But we're also seeing a more multipolar world now. China wants to play its role. And my own personal view is I don't think China wants to take over the world, but they don't want anyone telling them what to do in that's what they're focused on. And obviously they're obsessed with Taiwan in terms of what happens on that front. And we have Russia that's, I call it an angry, they're angry about a number of things. It's still a lot of research and innovation that goes on in that country, but they're a force. And I think we're starting to see other regional forces move. I think the Middle East is extremely important. Saudi Arabia, I think people underestimate their ambition. Whenever I go there, they're always talking about their role in the greater region, which is, they think of 50 countries, Africa, Central Asia. And you see, it's not just their capital, that they obviously have capital, it's the influence that they want to try and move. Brazil is another country that I think is very important that we pay attention to, because I don't believe they're going to pick a side. They're not American, they're not Chinese, but they do what they want. And so I think we need to understand these regional dynamics more than we ever have because of the change. The same in Asia. India is obviously going to be playing more of a role. Indonesia, which I just call, is a sleeping giant. It's 250 million people. A lot of people think it's corrupt and all sorts of challenges, but it continues to grow at 6% a year, and it is a force, and it's going to be amazing. So I think we need to factor that in to what we do in terms of relationships and where we are. The third force that's out there that I think is like gravity is climate change and the energy transition. And no matter I have to tell you, I'm a big believer in climate change, so I have to declare my bias. But it's the fact that this energy transition, which is the third we've done as humans, right? We went from wood to coal, and then coal to other fossil fuels, oil and gas. We're now moving into renewables. The challenge right now is the energy demand is continuing to grow. We're actually trying to substitute and grow, and I think we're running into challenges with that. But that energy transition, or at least how I'm looking at climate change, will itself be the single largest capital reallocation in human history. We've never will have done the capital reallocation like we're doing now and for the next 30 years. It's going to be about $10 trillion a year is required. And that actually I think is a huge opportunity, because when you look at these forces, I think you want to look for the tailwinds for innovation and also where the headwinds are. I see that as a tailwind. And I think what's changing on the energy transition and climate front, if I think about Rio Tinto and others, people are not going to be buying EVs because they're green. They're buying EVs because they're just better cars. And we're seeing that already occurring on the Chinese front. I don't know if people are aware of the SU7, which is it's a car that was built by Xiaomi, which makes the cell phones. And this is a startup. 2011, there were 7 people. 3 of them, the top 3, were trained in Pasadena, California, at the design school there. They're Chinese, trained, built this incredible cell phone business. And then in 2019, they were put in the Department of Defense banned list because it was a Chinese technology company. And they went, oh my God, we need a plan B. So they said, plan B, cars. No one knew anything about cars on that management team, 0. The DOD took the ban off so they could do their phone. They said, we still got to do it. So in the middle of COVID, they started a EV business. And in 2024, April, they launched the first car, which is this SU7. And the SU7 competes with the Porsche Taycan, but it's literally better on every single dimension. It's faster, it accelerates faster, it's got longer range on the battery, it's more comfortable, it's a nicer looking car, and it's a third the cost. And this is a company that had no idea how to build cars. And I think about Apple was thinking about this for 10 years, right? Building a car. They spent $10 billion, I think, doing this and stopped. But the innovation, BYD is another company, right? That's just, they in a sense, where are they coming from in terms of building these things? Solar power, wind power, these are becoming now, they're economically make sense to do, and they're actually better. And that's what I think will drive even more. It won't be about ESG. It's because they're better. But that said, that's going to be a huge, I think, force of change and opportunity. The fourth change itself is technology, and I probably should have made that the first one. But the challenge and the technology change is not just AI, which is obviously huge. It's the quantum, it's the nano. I got to see some of that here. This is again where I feel embarrassed telling you guys about technology when I should be taking notes and listening. But this change, AI, quantum, nano, biotech, and actually the ongoing digital revolution, we're just in the very early stages of where this is. And the challenge with technology is it actually doesn't care too much about politics. It moves. And there's a law, Roy Amara, who was with the Rand Corporation, it's Amara's law, which is we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. And I think that's been true of a lot. And I think that's the case with AI, even though there's a lot of hype. I would say there's that it's there. I think the impact of what that's going to do in terms of where we are is going to be profound. And it's interesting to see how organizations are trying to grapple with that. Some have it as small pet projects. Some people are actually trying to reinvent their business as an AI business to see where it is. And that gets more difficult the bigger you get, which we'll get to. But I think the AI revolution itself is going to be transformative. I think we're underestimating how quickly quantum is going to move and what that will also enable. And then I even things like fusion, which would be, people would think you're a joker even mentioning it. There is a lot of resources and energy that are moving on in these areas. So I think what technology is going to do in our lifetime is going to be dramatic. And I don't think our institutions are ready for that kind of a change. Is this timing okay? Do you guys tell me if I'm good?
We're just the students talking.
No. So yeah, I just want to because please give me feedback as I go. So that's the fourth force. I should have made it the first one because I think it's going to change everything. The only other thing I might mention on that, when I was leaving China, I stopped in Singapore, and there's the cabinet secretary. There's a guy named Leo Yip, who I think is one of the most thoughtful, strategic thinkers out there. And I stopped in Singapore for a couple of days, and I asked, what are you guys thinking about in strategy? This is again a government, but a very forward-looking, thoughtful government, thinking that their strategy discussion was going to be about U.S.-China relations and so forth. And when I said that to him, he looked at me like I was some sort of a fool. He said, really? That's what you think? I said, no, that's a big issue. And he goes, no kidding. But he said, no, what we're focused on is whether there will be nation states in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. And I'm going, what are you guys? What's that? And he goes, no, nation states have not been around forever. Of course, in our lifetimes and where it is, but more specifically, we are wondering whether technology and technology companies will become more powerful than nation states, especially for small countries. And more specifically, we're worried that, and maybe we shouldn't be worried, but we want to be open and aware to the idea that citizens may be more loyal to a technology platform like Meta than they are to the country, because guess what? Meta's providing healthcare. Meta's providing education. Meta's starting to provide a lot of services that we provide, and people are finding their own community. So it's, again, I'm not suggesting that's happening, but what I am taking from that is people thinking about bold questions about what it might mean in terms of where they are and how they operate. And I think that infects the system, the education system, infects how government works. It affects about who they try to attract to work in their country. You mentioned one organization I was involved in, which I probably really enjoyed the most, was the Economic Development Board of Singapore. It makes Procter & Gamble or any marketing organization you think of look like jokers. They are so focused in terms of what they want, in terms of foreign direct investment. And typically what happens is the most senior civil servants go into that role, and then they move. It's a place that's so critically important to get foreign direct investment into the country. And so their networks around the world are unbelievable, and they're very deliberate. Again, for a small country, thinking about how they move it. But the fifth force, which is also out here, and it's happening everywhere, is this increasing income inequality and polarization. There is not a single country on earth that hasn't experienced in the last 20 years significant polarization. And just to give you some numbers, in 2022, in the UK, 37% of income goes to the top 10%. That used to be 28% in 1980. In China, 44% of income goes to the top 10%. That was 27% in 1980. In the US, 48% goes to the top 10 versus 33%. And in fact, in the US, the wealthiest 10% of American households are now responsible for half of all consumer spending and a third of the country's GDP. And then to make it even more extreme, the 2% of US wealth is now concentrated in 19 households, right? And then you have social capital as well has diminished. So there's less familiarity. One of my favorite books of all time was the Robert Putnam book, Bowling Alone. I don't know if you know that book, just talking about social capital. And I remember someone sent me this book in McKinsey when I'd just become elected as senior partner. And I got this book on like bowling alone. I was in Korea. This guy who sent it to me, his name was Jerome Vassaleur. I said, "What there was only 2 Dominics in McKinsey at that time." I said, "You must have sent this book to the wrong Dominic because I don't do bowling." And he said, "Why don't you read the book? I sent it to you. Read the book and then call me." And what the basic thesis of Putnam was that social capital actually drives a lot of GDP growth, how well connected people are, how familiar people are. And his notion was in the 60s, there used to be bowling leagues in the US. I didn't grow up in the US. I was in Uganda, so I didn't know. But there were, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, church, whatever religion. There were people from all different walks and backgrounds were together, and it was social capital. And he was arguing at the time that TV was beginning to make people more isolated. It was before social media, and saying this is a big problem if we don't deliberately look for it. This guy was sending the book to me in McKinsey because, as you said, it's a bunch of cats that do different. You have to build social capital in a firm, and if you don't invest in building social capital, you're probably not going to be successful, even though it doesn't look like you're making progress you need to. But so this polarization and declining social capital is obviously a huge issue in countries, but it's also a huge issue among countries. Like I worry a lot about the breakdown in relationships. When I was in China as the ambassador, the thing I wished I could have done more, and I actually called some of the people who were involved. Canada had a program called CEDA, the Canada International Development Agency. I think that soft, if I could call it soft power, the linkages and the relationships that built in China and Asia was the only reason we were able to have relationships, because we'd actually educated people who are now vice ministers and they loved Canada because of that, even though they were angry. They couldn't separate themselves from actually having had some linkage, if you will. And it was quite controversial. I think after people, why did we spend all this money doing that? But I think that's a different type of social capital, which I think we have less of. So the world's going through all these changes with less and less social capital, so it's more brittle. And the way I look at it is like the probability curve has flattened. It's kind of what was normal has become less. And that means there's more downside risk, but there also means there's more upside. Like I'm a frightened optimist in all of that. I think there's a lot, and that's where innovation comes in, because I think that's where breakthrough ideas, orthodoxies come through when you have change, rupture. The only worry I have is I also think we're now, and I'm embarrassed saying it here, when you are at war, but I think from a world point of view, we're only one standard deviation from major conflicts, because we somehow become used to this now. I think the Ukraine-Russia thing globally has really hit people. I'm not saying but you're seeing it all the time. But people are now, the violence, if you will, that's out there, the India-Pakistan situation, even the China-India stuff. What was shocking to me being there is when the line of actual control between China and India, there's no border. It's like a open, sort of a 40-kilometer space where it hasn't been decided. And what the two countries have tried to do to reduce violence is no guns are allowed, actually, by border patrols. The problem is people then started killing each other with sticks, and the shock that had, I think, in China, but also there was something. So again, we're in a flatter probability curve. There's a huge amount of change that's going on. It's a more dangerous period, but I also think let's not forget that other side of the curve, which is where the opportunity is. And that's where I just wanted to talk a little bit about organizations and then innovation. And I think when we think about this change, one way I look at it is the average lifetime of a company. And when I was in McKinsey, we were coming up to our 100th anniversary, so I was very concerned about this, right? Like, what's the time frame? And in 1935, which wasn't a great year to be in the S&P 500, it was a depression, the average lifetime, if you were in that group, was 90 years, right? The average lifetime of an S&P 500 company in 2018 is 15 years, right? So the metabolic rate of the world has gone up. And so I think every organization needs to put that into their head. What right do we have to be here unless we are innovating or changing in what we're doing? Because if you're not, you're likely going to disappear in where you move. And I think that, I'm not saying being longevity is the aim, but I'm saying that there are things we can learn about organizations that are able to adapt and shift through these types of changes. And there were a couple of things I just wanted to take away from looking at that. And there were 7, so I'm going to rat through. One is it's extremely important to have bold ambition. No matter where you are, you need to set the bar high in terms of where you're operating. And this goes also for universities, I think, as well. I remember one of the most inspiring ones I saw was at Cambridge University. Alison Richards, who was the vice chancellor, wrote this speech. It was a very short speech, but the title of the speech was High Ambition. And basically she made the argument, she said, we are an 800-year-old institution. Who, if not us, are going to raise the bar? It sounded arrogant a bit, but it was this notion of we need to be raising the bar. What did our founders do? How did we move through it? We need to raise the ambition. And what I find surprising is in many parts of the world, many companies that have the resources, it's the lack of ambition that actually leads to it. It's not the capability. It's actually, and I don't mean selfish ambition, I mean a collective ambition. And so one of the places I got drilled on that was actually in South Korea. South Korea, I think, is one of the business leaders there are some of the most ambitious I've ever met. And I used to keep a picture in my London office of the POSCO pit. So POSCO is a steel company. And in 1969, the president of South Korea, the head of the industry group and the labor union said, we're going to build a steel company. The World Bank went to them and said, you guys are out of your minds. You have no energy, you have no resources, and you have no economy. You have no right to be building a steel company. And I know if I was in McKinsey at that point, McKinsey wasn't there, I would have laid my body across the pit to prevent them from blowing it up because it was so stupid, if I might. POSCO is today the world's most productive steel company by far. It's the most innovative. And I have a picture of these guys literally sitting ready to blow the dynamite in this pit, 3 people, just with ambition. Samsung is one other story. In 1998, Samsung was almost bankrupt. It was after the Asian financial crisis. We were doing some work for them. The project was called Project One. It was which is find every cent, because it was going under, literally how much can we get for this chair? We'll sell it. And one day I came into the office and there was a sign in Korean that said, beat Sony. And Sony was the Apple at the time. And I was so upset. This is crazy. We're trying to survive and not go bankrupt. And this guy wants to take on. So I went into the chairman's office. He was about 75 years old, didn't speak a word of English. And he sat down. I said, something, I have to, we tell truth to power. I have to tell you, I just find there's something really wrong. And he said, tell me. I said, how can you put a sign like that out when we're trying to make this company survive? And then he tapped me on the arm, and the translation came back. That's why I don't ask you for advice. And I was shocked. I said, well, and he goes, because that's not, he said, we are here to win. And if we get through this, which we will be able to beat any company on earth. That's what we're doing here. So please don't talk to my people. Do your work and shut up, because I don't want you infecting the group. Right? And then he said, the other thing he said to me at the end, he said, and remember something, if you looked at our history, we started as a yeast company. We made yeast. That's what Samsung. So he said, we can do anything we want. We just have to set the ambition. So I could go with Singapore. And I remember sort of like Canadian friends, when I was living in Vancouver, there's this huge pile of sulfur sitting in the middle of the British properties that are probably some of the most valuable real estate in North America. And I don't know why we have a sulfur pile. My view is, why don't we move it? And my advice at that time was, what we should do is sell that land to the Singaporeans for an outrageous amount of money and then watch what they do. Because with little, they will completely, that sulfur pile will be there, but it won't be in a place that will get in the way. It'll be properly taken care of and all that stuff. So I think we just have to think, and I should, saying this in Israel is a bit of a joke, because I think Israel is in that league of being ambitious. But it's really important, I think, to, as organizations, to be ambitious. It's not a bad thing to be be number one. There's no reason, with this world that's changing, there is no reason that cannot be the case, because everyone's having to think about it. So sorry, it's a bit too long on the ambition, but I feel strongly about it. The second is challenge all your orthodoxies, accept your values. And because and every organization has orthodoxies. It's how you deliver, or how you make your product, how you deliver your product or services, how you price it, who you recruit, all how you make decisions. There are orthodoxies, and I think what I try and do is try and boil it down to 8 that are, and then accept the values. Like, I think that's fundamental. Challenge every single one of them, because if you don't, someone is. And what I tried to do when I was in McKinsey over that period, I really felt in McKinsey, we loved to tell other organizations what to do, but we would never take our own medicine. We would be preaching loudly, but then when you try to bring it inside, so no, we're different. That doesn't apply. So my view is we needed to put like heart paddles on the place. And so I figured out that about every 8 months I could jolt the place. And so one of the last things I did as I was finishing my time was to actually challenge the recruiting system, because McKinsey's typically, it used to be said that diversity in McKinsey in the 1960s was hiring someone from Wharton. They used to be all Harvard. Everyone came from Harvard. Then it was all MBAs. Then it was non-MBAs. So my challenge was to say, we need to hire 10 people with no university degree. People were like, how can you, what will clients say? They don't. I said, university, with all respect, should not be the definite. There's smart people that didn't finish university or weren't able to go to, and we can now have systems to find those people. But the point is, I think if we don't challenge those orthodoxies, others will. And that's where I think a lot of innovation comes in. And the problem with that is those orthodoxies are very deep, difficult things to shift in organizations. But I think the first thing to do is to outline them and make them open to people, and then systematically do it. And again, I would err towards more of the Samsung model on where it is. Anything is possible. The third is really how you organize yourself in the new geopolitical world. I think you have to think about how your supply chain is organized. If you're in China, you better have a supply chain that's built for China. If you're Nestle, you can't have, and your 2 biggest markets in the world are China and the US, you can't have one supply chain. You need to have 2, right, in terms of how you operate, how you manage your data, where you do your R&D, how you think about your capital. I think there's more nationalism now. I think about this as Rio Tinto. We're a multinational, but people don't really care about multinationals right now. No one gets excited about a multinational. No, but what people in your country get excited if you are part of where they are. So I think, we operate in 35 countries. People think we're Australian. A big part of what we do is Australia, but big part of what we do is in Canada. It's should we be listed in Canada? Should we be listed in Mongolia? Should we be listed in the United States? Should we have a separate board? Because no one cares about the Rio Tinto, but they want to see this linkage. And I think we're going to see a lot more of what the global organization looks like has to be done differently. The fourth is reallocating resources aggressively. Companies that last for longer than 30 years typically reallocate somewhere in the order of 5 to 7% of their capital every year. And this is a very difficult thing to do. Shell was probably the one that came up with this. They would, in their budgeting process, would say, next year, we're going to only give you 92% of what you had last year, and then we're going to reallocate the rest depending on where the growth is. And that sounds easy, but it's very difficult to do that because everyone thinks their area is important. And McKinsey was the worst at this. When I've tried to put that in, people are like, well, we're all growing. How can you take it away? I said, well, we need to, because some areas need to move further. I think one of the hardest places to try and do that, by the way, is in a university. I think universities are it's challenging, right? Or in government departments and so forth. But this idea of how to think about reallocation of your capital and your people at that level is actually something that needs to be done, and that can actually help as I get to it on the innovation. The fifth is the data and analytics opportunities. I think they're huge. I think the place I would learn the most from that on how to do that is actually China and Indonesia. The Chinese digital market is bigger than the entire German economy, right? There's, believe it or not, some cities in China have a night mayor for the night market, and they have a digital mayor for the digital market. That's just how big it is, right? And that actually affects supply chains. And there's no reason we can't do that in other parts of the world, and how you can configure it in different areas. But some places where we want to look for benchmarks may not be the usual places. Talent is the other one. When I was at McKinsey, I had a rule of I had to see 2 leaders a day, 2 CEOs a day, because I wasn't allowed to serve clients in when I was managing partner for 9 years. But that's where I actually got a lot of my energy. So I would require myself just to do that. And I would always ask 3 sets of questions. One is, if you could do your job over again as leader, what would you focus on? And the second one was around, what would you teach your 21-year-old self? If you could look back, what would you do? And the third one was more, what excites you or frightens you the most, and what, you know what I mean? And on the question of what would you, where would you focus and what would you be doing? All of the answers, basically, it's like 3,600 people, not 100%, but very close to 100%, was on people. And it was people. It basically was, I would remove people faster that weren't performing. That sounds very harsh, but I'd be taking people out faster. I would move people up faster, give younger people more of a chance, chuck them in the swimming pool, and they typically know how to swim. And the third is just spend more time with people. And yet in most organizations, especially business organizations, the amount of time that's spent on people is very small compared to the time that's spent on finance and capital allocation. It's almost as though people is an afterthought, when in fact it's the driver of what you need to do. So this thinking about talent from where you're going to generate and drive the most change, and it's a small number that can do it, is key. And the final comment is just speed. And what I usually do in these is I show a picture of a 1960s Formula One stop where you see it takes 4 minutes to change the tires, and you hear this commentator literally going crazy about how fast this is amazing. They're taking the wheel off. This Joe's working on the bolt. It's got this, and then I show Melbourne 2001, which is sort of like 2.5 seconds. But the speed of the world's gone up. So and it's something I wonder about, why this is not measured in an annual report. What is the clock speed of this organization, and what's the metabolic rate? Like, how quickly can they make decisions? How quickly can they shift resources, the agility? How quickly do they move people? And we don't measure it. And so I think speed in this flattened world is going to be more important. And again, I think there's a lot we can learn from the digital companies that operate in very, 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 very different ways. And one story I'll give you there is Apple. I remember talking to Tim Cook, and he asked me for what's the latest thinking on organization charts. And so I drew a chart. He looked at me, and said, "Seriously, you think that's a org chart?" And I said, "Well, could tell me what your org chart looks like." And he drew a circle with him in the middle. And then he said, "My org chart depends on the issues of the day. So this week, the direct report I have is the VP in Japan for Apple cell phone sales, right? But of course that changes next week. Most of us think of an org structure as pretty permanent, right, as you go through it. So just thinking about how you run a place in a world like this for speed, I think is quite different than what we're being taught with the structures that are in place. They're not as agile. So just the final part, just on the innovation. And again, I'll start with, when I started my business career again in 1986, if I looked at the top 10 companies that were on the list, so 1986, the top 10 companies were Exxon, Shell, Amoco, GM, Toyota, IBM, GE, AT&T, Procter & Gamble, DuPont. They're very American list, right? The players are. None of those are on the list today, of course, right? Today, it's Microsoft, Apple, NVIDIA, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Broadcom, Tesla, Saudi Aramco, and Berkshire Hathaway, right? Is sort of and then if you look at I mentioned the S&P 500. If I was just to compare the list when I started my business career, the companies I aspired to want to work with or I saw as role models, today only 53 are left of that 500. And that's where I think this is the opportunity because I look now at the new businesses that are for sure going to be created. I don't know if I'm going to live another 40 years or not, but I will guarantee you that that those companies will likely not be on the list, and there's going to be some fundamentally different ones. And that's again on the positive side of the curve. And that's where I think it's incumbent that you think about the businesses that you can build. And a role model for me right now is actually a lot of the Scandinavian companies. You mentioned, I was on the board of Investor AB, which is the Wallenberg family's investment vehicle. And they own about 35 companies. And it's amazing to see this country. It's a little like Sweden's not a big country, but they punch way above their weight in terms of the companies that they have. A lot of technology companies, and so you just look at recently at ABB, right? It's a machinery company making complex electronics and products, and they've just decided to spin out their robot business. That's going to be put to so that ABB it's still a top European company, but it is very different today than what it looked like before, because they've had the guts to be able to say, we've got to carve this out, move this into different places. And so I think there are a lot of examples of organizations that are able to do it. And the kind of odd thing is that often the biggest, largest, wealthiest companies who actually have a lot of the ideas and the strategy and the insight don't make the changes. We all know the long story, but Kodak knew before anyone else about digital and what might happen. You can see it also with IBM in terms of what Bell Labs and so forth. But there was this inability to be able to go for it, to risk or to separate out or to push things. And that's where I think for large companies the opportunities are, and that resource reallocation is key. And so if I even think about Rio Tinto, where I'm working, it's a boring mining company, right? We are not on the list of Apple. But if you don't have the material, there will be no cell phones. If there's no copper, there'll be no energy transition. If there's no lithium, but we need to think in fundamentally different ways about what we do and have more R&D. So that having a chief scientist, which by the way is based in Montreal, having an R&D unit and a venture capital fund that draws on universities. That's one of the things I was doing this morning, like Hebrew University, like Waterloo University, like MIT, like Stanford, for ideas on material science, because there's going to be new metals that are going to be developed. And if we don't figure out how to be in that in a significant way, we won't be around in 10 to 20 years. But that can be difficult with investors, because investors want dividends. They're not that excited about long-term bets. And this is where, again, you have to take ownership in saying, we are going to have to be making these investments, and we need to make sure we have investors that understand how to do that. And then the whole other aspect, in my view, is then thinking about the startups, which is and helping to grow them. And I think one of the most fundamental things is there's so many books are written, so many tours come here to learn what's happening here in Israel or what's happening in the Silicon Valley and so forth. But fundamentally, for what I think is critical is capital. And in this world that's flattening, because the ideas, the kind of the ambition and the drive can be there, and those are scarce, and you need to work on them. But you've got to get the capital to be able to do it. And I think that this is an area where I think governments need to be more aggressive in this increasingly nationalistic world of how do we secure access to capital to enable the ideas and the startups to be able to move. Because again, I think AI, while there may be a bit of hype that's going on now, is going to fundamentally lead to many new businesses, and we need the capital to be able to fuel the resources that are going to be able to drive it. And the other area I think we need to be focusing on, this is where I don't think in society we invest enough money in universities doing deep research, is because this is where the true breakthroughs come through. This morning, as I was going through looking at all the amazing innovation that's underway here, there's some orthodoxies, like we're lucky that we have mathematics. We're lucky that we have language. We're lucky that we learned about the spectrum. And my own personal view is I think there's 3 or 4 of those that we don't know that are out there, that we don't know, that need to be discovered. And I don't know who's going to discover that except a university, and allowing someone to be allowed to do pure research for the sake of research. And there's a very famous paper written in 1939 by Wexner, which is called The Usefulness of Useless Information. I don't know if people recall that. And he basically was arguing that, Marconi, who invented the radio, actually the real genius behind that was some German scientists 100 years earlier that were trying to understand spectrum and electromagnetism and so forth. And I was actually given this lesson by the former head of Caltech, who worried again that McKinsey was too focused on financial returns, short term. And he said, I at Caltech hired someone who was obsessed with being able to mathematically model a jellyfish. That was his. That was his obsession. So I hired him. He goes, you wouldn't have. I said, you're damn right I would not have. He goes, so, what angioplasty and the heart valves, guess where the thinking for that came from? It came from this guy who mathematically modeled jellyfish. He didn't come up, but his analysis and thinking was drawn on to build that. And I don't think we value that enough, and that's long term, and that's why I think we need to be pouring the resources, because now there's going to be more breakthroughs as we go through. Anyhow, I blathered I'm going to shut up finally. I know that. Thank you for listening.
So thank you, Dominic. That was a fascinating trip through ideas. And I came with a whole set of questions, and you actually forced me to change everything by looking at that. And these are just my notes from listening to you. So I think my first question is more about the future of governance and government during this age where we have so many crises attacking us from so many different directions. If it's in the political spectrum of populism, if it's in the scientific spectrum, if it's in the area of climate crisis, etc. Is Singapore the model that you think we should all be aspiring to?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll start by saying I agree with I do think we should be thinking about that, because and this is probably heresy, I probably get a lightning bolt on, but even, how democracy works, how it was set up, the conditions are quite different. I believe in democracy, but the way we do it, maybe that should change. Do you know what I mean? And because I guess if I think about the pieces I worry about, we have a fundamental problem as humans, I think, in being long-term. And you can't change an education system in a 3-year period. But we know it needs to be changed. It takes a very brave political leader to say, I'm going to work on fixing the education system when you probably won't see any results, maybe after you're gone, type of a thing. So I think we have some challenges in this world on long-term decision. Infrastructure is another one. And that's where I think there's some elements of Singapore that I would take. They actually have a strategy. They have a view.
Strategy that is more than 18 months to the future.
More than 18, yeah. And so did South Korea. I remember one other story. I was advising the president of South Korea, and he had this advisory group, and we were starting the thing off, and he said, I thought he said 50 years. And I said, you mean 15, right? It was and he goes, I said 50. And I said, how can you do a strategy for 50? And he goes, actually, Dom, he said, I actually was going to say 100 years, but he basically said, but he literally called me, you're a dumb Westerner. And you can't think that way and but that was their sense of history, 5,000 years, that was so I think there's something about this, a long-term view. You can't predict it, but enable how you drive it. So there's something on the decision-making. How do you do that? Like, for example, I'm very glad that we don't vote on who the Federal Reserve chairman is, right? Thank goodness Alexander Hamilton didn't make that part, even though Trump may, who knows what he might do. But, you imagine if the interest rate or that sort of was changed. There's certain things we assume a government's going to drive, and I think we should think about that. The other element I worry about in governance is, with the world with this flattened curve, and I think technology will accelerate this, the polarization is going to get worse. It is now, it's going to be easier and easier for fewer and fewer to make an enormous amount of money, and others, and that's not a stable system. And if we don't think about how you're going to do it, tax is people don't like it, it's but there's going to be some system that has to come into place to make sure people have housing, that their lives, this wealth, we haven't figured that out. We seem to go between, it needs to be all about wealth creation, and then you figure out how you do it, or others are, left, right, I think is wrong. So I'm not answering it, but I think there's fundamental orthodoxies that should now be challenged. And the strange thing about the Singapore one is them thinking about technology companies. Where do people feel more linked? I'm not saying that's the case, but if we don't work more, aren't able to focus more on long-term issues and sort out this polarization, I think we're going to have chaos, because that's what's more in common with different parts of the world than others.
No, I think I tend to agree with you. I was at a conference last week, and one of the themes that came up was that democracy is sick, and it might not survive the next 20 years. And that's a little bit worrying, obviously. The other thing, of course, that came up, and we cannot have any meeting today in the world without saying it, is, of course, artificial intelligence, and the effect that is going to have on. And one of the main themes that came up around there, which I thought was interesting, was that AI is clearly going to be a deflationary force. Yeah. So the size of the market is going to get smaller. The amount of capital available to people because of this effect is going to be smaller. But at the same time, the power of that single human with a good idea to build something in a few weeks' time is going to be much, much larger. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I always thought it was always interesting that, you saw Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt writing about technology, and Henry Kissinger saying, look, I'm not qualified to write about AI, but I will write about the philosophy, because our philosophy is not kept up with the technology. And I think that's a very important part. It's a bit like the democracy thing. We need I don't care John Stuart Mill, Rousseau, people who are thinking about how this is going to shape where things are in a holistic way, I think is needed. I'm actually more optimistic in terms of what AI will create, because I go back to that 1986 when I started. There were no cell phones. There was no PC, I've joked with people, my very first project in McKinsey was to figure out how many pieces of Kentucky Fried Chicken should be in a lunch pack, 5 or 6. That was and it took 6 months. And we don't talk about, we charged Kentucky Fried Chicken $15 million to figure. We would obviously never be hired to do that work. But part of that was because there was no data, right? We had to go and survey people. We had to watch people. We had to do the economics of a piece of chicken, all this. That now, with the data we have today, someone, probably a 12-year-old could probably do that in 2 hours type of a thing. But what's happened is that hasn't meant McKinsey's gone away. The work's changed. And I think there's going to be I think we're going to see a lot of I'm excited about the new services and businesses that we can't imagine that may come from AI. I don't, it could be on the health side, the leisure side, but my worry is is more the concentration of that wealth, and are people not going to have, is our skilling system keeping up with that? Because we may have people that are not doing anything. Maybe there's that universal income that comes in, but I don't think that's a sustainable, but we have to think about it. So I don't know, but I think it's very fundamental in terms of all things that we do. And I think it's going to be more unequal.
All the finance people that I met at that conference last week laughed when I raised the issue of UBI, and they said, do the numbers. It's unsustainable. There's no way that's going to happen. And therefore, either population is going to go down or revolution is going to go up. So it's a pretty...
But I'm with you. I actually think we will... I'm more in the camp of I think we will see universal income. There's going to have to be some basic level. It's not... With the information, people just will not put up with it. I look at... I'm living in the UK right now, 54 million people. 17 million people are living below the poverty line. You can't ignore, at some point, people are just going to say, and there's children that are not, this is the UK. That's not a stable operating environment. So, I think something will have to change.
Completely. So, in a world where potentially in the future, a single person could be a corporation, multiply themselves n times using digital surrogates, et cetera, and offer their services. What is going to be the place for the future McKinseys in the world?
Yeah. Well, I think it will be really, I think it'll be different. In some ways, I think it might be smaller because I think a lot of capacity on the analytics side is not going to be needed. I think there's other issues and problems to work on, but I think it'll be smaller. It may also be older because I think I think actually wisdom will be even more important than just analytics because the AI can do it. So McKinsey used to, in the 1920s and 30s, the average age of a McKinsey person was probably 55 years old. It was sort of experienced people who'd run businesses. In the 60s, during that kind of McNamara, World Bank, Young Turks, analytic, I'd say the average age swung to 23, right? It's a young person's, this is about analytics. I think it might shift. I think it will be more involved in actually investing. Like, I think it'll have a bigger capital arm. Like it won't just be about ideas. It'll be wanting to deploy those ideas. So I think capital will become a big part of it. I remember I would always make sure on this orthodoxy thing I'd be listening to people. One person who I would listen to a lot and still is Steve Schwartzman from Blackstone, and I would literally say, okay, if you take over McKinsey, what would you do? And please don't say you'd sell it, like, whatever. But what would you do? And he was his thing. I remember this because you should have capital. I don't know why you don't have capital that goes, with the ideas. I think you should be you should train people. You should have a training capability that's not related to what you do. Mm-hmm. So I think it will, those are some ideas, but I'm pretty sure it'll be quite different. The values, I think, will be the same. Client first, truth to power. Like, I think those won't change, but what people are actually working on and how we use capital or others, I think will change.
And that kind of brings us back to the place that we are sitting here within a research university. And last week I showed some of my students some AI tools in one of my courses, and things that up to 2 years ago would have taken them about a month of work can now take them an hour of work. And some of these people were computer science students, et cetera, and they said, why are we studying what we're studying right now? And I'd like to connect that to what you were saying about social capital, because it seems to me, until the day that we all become a food source for computers, et cetera, but until that day, I think the issue of social capital will be one of the major important capabilities and toolkits that are available to us for developing success. Yes, you can be a great programmer, but in 99% of those cases, you can be replaced by a machine in the next few years. Yes, there will always be that top 1% to 2% that will not be replaceable. But if you do not have the interactive capability to work with people, to develop relationships with people, et cetera, and to enjoy the relationships with people, then maybe you're going to have a problem.
I totally agree. I mean, I think we were having a conversation earlier this morning too about philosophy. I find it, I think the social sciences are a really important part of the hard sciences. And this is what I'd say, just for what one person's view, I think we tend to specialize people too soon. And I think I find it really interesting that Alex Karp, who developed Palantir, Peter Thiel, they actually have PhDs in philosophy. It's not just computer. I'm just saying I'm a big believer in computer. So I think we need to have that as part of like rethinking education. And I think AI can actually help on that. When MOOCs came out, I was saying this to someone else, those massive online courses, that was all the fad. A lot of CEOs took those courses, and you know what the most popular topic was for a MOOC for CEOs was philosophy, like basic. So these are people running technology companies, industrial companies, and it was philosophy there, because it's how to do critical thinking, how to make right versus right decisions, so in a strange way, I think we need to know the technology will advance, but go really develop that. And then I think the other part is being part of contributing to society. And again, I'm the last person to say it here, but the military service, the sense of I may be a deep, thinker in this particular area, but I also have a duty. There's something very important in cohesiveness of a place that brings people. And I think we should think more carefully about that. I don't think it has to be all military, but some service that's done. And I think it's interesting, Singapore does that in their way too, right? There's you're required to be able to do it. And I think we're going to have to be more dogmatic about that in the education. The last thing, I'm wandering around, in one of the events we had, I mentioned to a number of people when we were doing a McKinsey leadership session, we had Shimon Peres speaking, and he was actually provoking us. Like he was like challenging us orthodoxies. And it was fun, but it was quite shocking. And he wanted to talk about education. And he started off by saying, who in God's name came up with the idea of putting a 14-year-old boy and girl behind a desk for 6 hours a day? Like what maniac came up? We were looking at him saying, well, that's how it works. And he said, I think 9-year-olds should work. I said, like, work what? Like in a factory. And I was like, whoa, he's really got. But the idea was, he obviously didn't believe in child, but it was more, we need to learn how things work. And that, I think that's an orthodoxy on education that I think we need to start to think about. How can we learn these other capabilities beyond what I'm doing. I think AI is going to make that easier for us. It won't take as long. I hope it'll shorten it, but maybe make us more broad-minded in a way in how we think about things, making sure people understand there's a lot of luck involved in how people do certain things, or you understand more about why people operate. One thing I'm focused on now is you look at CEOs, there's a tendency at times that they start in a particular fashion, they're driving it, then there's a second phase. The third phase can actually they get caught up in them. They think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. I call it more like Davos person, right? They're everything they do, and people know it, but so how do you self-regulate yourself, if I might, and how?
Like Elon Musk.
Elon, yeah.
So my last question, I'm going to try to put a few things together here. From your very wide experience over time and over the different things that you've been doing, you said $10 trillion a year over the next number of years in order to kind of save this Earth from the climate catastrophe that might be happening here. How do we get something of that size done within a political environment where everything is 18 months and not 100 years?
Yeah, that's a great question, because while we're not able to do that...
I'll add one last thing to that. I fear that many times politicians are waiting for the innovations that will save them. So they're hoping that we will innovate out of the problem instead of solving the problem.
That's where I was going to... But, I worry about that a lot, because the LA fires, the fires here in Jerusalem, I don't, you know what I mean? Just even Rio Tinto, we're focused on decarbonizing, but one of our biggest ports, it's actually the biggest private rail system in the world for the iron ore. We had a cyclone hit that it's off the charts in terms of it's a 1 in 350 year. In 3 hours, we got more rain than 3 months, and it completely flooded the system, broke the port basically. And so this climate change is affecting our assets right now. And you've got Singapore, who, by the way, what they're worried about is they're actually buying red mud from Australia to build a wall around, because they said we're going to be underwater before we know it. So we can see this now, and yet we're denying it, or we're not shifting it. I think part of it, there has to be, I almost wonder if we, in this democracy rethink, can we somehow have the younger generation vote on how we do it, because they're the ones that are going to live with it. So we can, when you have...
The Ministry of the Future, there's a book that came out.
That's a very good, some power, because they're the ones, when I look at it, I've older kids and younger kids, they're the ones that are going to be saying, what the hell are you doing? And again, I know it's not Greta doing her, that has one thing. It's how do we get them to do I know that sounds, there's got to be a way to get that in there. And the other part, I think humans are greedy and more selfish than we think. We are long-term, but we also, and so I think we've got to focus on the things that we're doing on those 10 trillion that are being spent. It's actually because it's in the consumer interest. So I'm going to buy an EV because it's just a better, I like that car better than an ICE car. And I think that rather than saying it's because it's green, I'm going to drive this particular car, I think that's beginning to shift to say, I want it, because there's nothing, so how can we use the consumer on it? But the only other part I think about is a carbon tax. And I know no one, we're not pricing this properly. The challenge is we don't have necessarily, as you said, rational leaders. If it was a company, I'm not saying companies make lots of mistakes, but you'd look at the economics and you'd say, we need a carbon price. That would be what you do, but we don't. And that's where, I don't know, there's something about getting maybe I like your idea of a ministry of the future. We have to have more voice coming from the people that are going to be affected. And it might even be that voice, maybe the young people, and then to use a Shimon, it may be the people that are 85 and above, because they actually care. They're not so much cared on. They're actually cared about the future or the next generation. I don't know. That's why we need the university to come up with the idea.
So it's back to us, guys. So a few questions, please, sir.
I have a question about Japan. You mentioned Asia when you at the beginning, at the top of your speech. First of all, it seems like it's fourth largest economy, having somewhat of a cultural renaissance. It's a hot location for a midlife crisis, it seems. But my question is, it seems that they're totally out of the international game. I mean, you see China, you see other powers, but Japan seems very reclusive, almost isolationist. I mean, I might not know it, but what's your take on Japan and its role in the future of the region?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think we underestimate Japan, because on hard technology, I think they're one of the leaders in the world. They're not on the software of technology, but on the hardware. And you see it with their, precision instruments. If for example, you talk to the CEO of Toyota, what he's most interested in is he'd love to come here, because it's nanotechnology, material science. They're very much so. I think we underestimate their technology depth, and I think there's more that's going to come from that. But I also agree they punch way below their weight in terms of scale. And I think the 1980s boom, where they were going to become the number one, there was a exuberance and arrogance that was so hot. You saw the real estate. I remember at one point, actually, where we have the Canadian embassy, it's one of the most beautiful embassies down to the value of the land, 1 square mile around that was more than the entire value of California, right? And I think they went inward, if you will. It was like, and I think that's taken a lot, and it's a society that's very honor and respect, and I think that has taken they've been in that period for a while, but I think they're actually beginning to come out. Part of it is they're actually worried about the world. They're worried about China. They're worried, and so you see, they've actually started talking about, do we nuclearize? Do we get an army again? That would have been unheard of 5 years ago. It's now we have to think about what we're doing. So I think they're slowly going to come back. They're playing a very big role in India. We don't sort of see that because it's almost like an intra-Asia thing, but the biggest investor in India is Japan. They're big time in that part of also ASEAN, Thailand, Indonesia. So I think they're going to move, and I think it is a place it's got its own culture, but they also have some amazing hard technology.
I'll just add to that. I was on an ecosystem tour to Japan a few months ago, and I was very impressed from a number of things. First of all, the amount of capital that the government is now putting into pushing for the creation of startups and young companies is astounding. I think it's more money that they know what to do with, and I'll be happy to help them spend it. But they're really doing some major things, and they like to say the following sentence: the Japanese giant is starting to wake up. That's one thing. They have one major problem. They still don't know English. I think now only this year they're starting to put English as part in the formal studies.
That's a really good. I actually think that's a really good point. Whereas I think China has actually is much more. They've done more of that. Yeah, but I think it's definitely a place to spend time. Yeah.
So my name is Nissim, and I'm a master student at the Department of Computer Science. I can help by notice two things that you talk about in this conference. First, the importance of mastering numbers. And secondly, the way that you don't afraid of people who speak to you in a harsh way. You even quoted them. I think this is inspirational things that I can learn from you. the question is this. I'm planning to found a tech company. And while I have had many valuable conversations with entrepreneurs and venture capital partners, I rarely heard about the role of strategic consulting firms in this journey. From your experience, when does engaging with a firm like McKinsey start to add a real value? For me, as someone who wants to create a really big startup, when do you think I should begin building this relationship, even in an early stage before fundraising or go to market?
That's a great, great question. I would like one thing I'm saying about building relationships and getting ideas and mentorship and so forth. I would do it immediately. Like go if I don't want to speak on behalf of former McKinsey, but I would go. And I'll mention it to what David and just say I want to meet someone. I've got this thing going. Someone may say, "Look, I'm too busy," but no one's going to tell you to bugger off. Do you know what I mean? I would go and ask. Don't try and figure it out yourself. Like what you do, go take the initiative. And one of the things I learned from, and it's not a McKinsey thing, it was a business thing. Was maybe more. I was more in an academic path. I felt you had to figure it out on your own. Like you had to discuss, just learn it, and it was kind of a solo thing. And whereas in the business world, it's ask as many people as you possibly can for ideas or advice or views, and that will work. And what I found is that I feel like I've got sort of 30 mentors on this shoulder and 30 on this, and they're not the most senior people. It was a middle manager I was working with. I asked them questions about how do you deal with it? How do you give negative feedback and inspire someone? Could you tell me how to do that? And they'll tell you how not to do it or whatever. So I would just don't go now, don't wait. Like just ask and talk about, this is what I'm trying to build. You obviously have got a lot of capability and ideas, and I think just finding people to bounce ideas off is a really good thing, and I think people will be interested. And they may not. The first person may not have time, but they will then say to them, "Well, tell me someone I can talk to." Like be a bit aggressive, and if they get mad at you, tell me I told you to be aggressive or whatever.
I'm going to take this opportunity to do marketing for what is available here at the university. So first of all, we have a number of programs here, like the Open Venture Creation Program, et cetera, that basically allow you to ask some of these questions in a very, very failure-friendly environment, okay? Pre-incorporated, you haven't spent a cent of anybody else's money, and when you spend somebody else's money, that's when you start to get stressed as an entrepreneur. And I think that you should take the time that you're here to explore these options, to speak with people, to get feedback, et cetera, and then part of what you'll be learning from us is that you need to speak to as many people as possible. I mean, yes, consultants is one thing, but it's even more important to speak with your potential clients and make sure that you're solving real problems to people, problems that are deep enough that they're willing to put their hands into their pockets and pay for that solution. But that's for later. We'll have two more questions.
Hi. Thanks for your talk earlier. My name is Mohammed. I'm an entrepreneur. I have 2 startups right now. And you mentioned earlier something really interesting about China and their focus on that in the future they see more power in the hands of companies. And then we see that in China, their approach is they support companies and they fund them so they don't need to rely on private capital and ventures. Where in the Westward and here, the government does encourage you to go more to private capitalism and ventures. And we see that with the China 10-year vision, we saw the rise of in EV cars companies and AI, DeepSeek recently, and we see that model has more accelerated these companies to go on a global scale, not just local. Where do you see the current governments around the world can learn from that model and that strategy?
Well, one thing just to clarify, I don't think it's the Chinese capital, government capital that's helped them. I think that it's actually private capital. But what the Chinese have done is set goals. So they have their 5-year plans. So in 2012, they basically said they believe in climate change. They said there's going to be an energy transition. At that time, if you were in Beijing, you'd have to wear a mask all the time because the pollution was so bad. It's just, we have to change. So they put in place a 10-year plan, say this is going to be important. What they put there is they said we want 25% of all vehicle sales in I think it was 2025 actually, to be electric vehicles. They didn't give money to come. And then the entrepreneurs like that, the Xiaomi people, they were like us, like 7 people. They just decided to go into the car business, right? And they used their capital, they used private capital to build it. But the thing was that the government had saying this is going to be critical, we support it, people are going to have to buy these vehicles. So they kind of created the condition, but the private market did it. And I would argue that one of the challenges they have right now is there's too much government capital in their venture capital funds. I don't think governments are not the best venture capital. I'd be very nervous about it. But that doesn't mean the governments can't have a direction or support and an infrastructure, for example, to be able to allow the things to happen. And that's where I think we can learn from, China, Singapore, even India right now India is quite a chaotic place, if I might, in terms of how but they now actually they've got goals that they're setting that people can kind of rally around and move around. But that's my interpretation.
Last question.
Hello, I'm Givat Zion from the Azrieli Engineering College across the road. Thank you for your talk, very inspiring. I wanted to ask you about the junior-senior problem. With the growth of AI, we see AI taking over more of the junior work of engineers, business people, even researchers. But you mentioned the value of wisdom will grow. Amnon mentioned social capital. How do we bridge that gap that the juniors will go away, but we will still need the seniors, maybe even more?
It's a great point. I mean, another way of that you're saying too is apprenticeship. The importance of apprenticeship, or because I think wisdom comes from practice, not from innate character. And judgment as well. And so, being able to give people experiences will be key. What I wonder is I think what'll have to happen is we have to just be very deliberate about how we can give younger people those types of experiences. It might be things like, it won't be necessarily just analytics, but building a new business or capability, or training someone to be able to do something, or diagnosing where a problem occurred, or you know what I mean, but sort of tasks like that can be done. But I think I think the education will have to change, because the model of doing the grunt work is not going to work. But I think there is something, and I think it's around experiences. I think one story I'll just say was we were working for an oil company, and it was growing so quickly that it couldn't build enough of the refinery managers. It usually took 10 years to build a refinery manager, let's say. And they were growing so quickly that they needed to figure out how to do that in 3 years. So the project was, how do we accelerate the speed with which someone develops? And I wasn't involved in the thinking of it, but I saw the output of it. And basically it was giving people as many different concentrated experiences in a shorter period of time. So what that meant was they had a full-time job, but then they had an initiative job that they were taking across the organization, and they mixed it up. So so those to me, that's not the answer, but it's the ingredients. I think we have to. The other part is actually this apprenticeship on wisdom, where I think it can come in, is also by shadowing people. And many people, when there's a very tough or important meeting, want to do it one-on-one. My view would be to bring a young person into a meeting. But one example, and I'll shut up, is early in my career in McKinsey, was in Canada. We were working for CIBC, which is a bank, and there was a problem occurred because the client situation was such that we were working with a client team. Half the client team decided they didn't agree with the way the project was going and basically said, we're going to have our own effort. It's like a really bad outcome for me, right? And I was the project manager, so this was really bad. And the senior partner, who was a guy who was probably 40 years older than me, that sort of came to me and said, this is a problem. And I said, yep, I know. I don't know what to. And he said, the chairman, by the way, is very angry. This guy named Al Flood. He said, he's really angry. And he basically is going to call both teams in. He's going to pick one and the other one he's going to fire. So we'll be fired with the client team. We'll win or the other. It's like that serious. And he said, this senior partner said, and you're going to come to the meeting with me. And I said, I don't think I should, that's a bad idea. I don't want to, they won't like it because I look like a punk, and I said, it's not going to work. And he said, you're coming. And he goes, you will not say a word. You will pour coffee and you will shut up and you will watch. And that's how you learn. And so anyway, we go into the meeting, and sure enough, the chairman, Al Flood, said, who's this Smurf you've brought from San Francisco? Literally, like, what's he doing? He shouldn't be in this meeting. And the senior partner said, he's in this meeting because he's here to learn. And he's very good at pouring coffee. If you want milk, he knows how to do that. If you don't, but he's there. And so we went in, and in a 1 hour meeting, in a very tense, difficult, I learned more than I would ever learn in anything else. And I'm forever grateful for the guy for taking the risk of me being in the meeting, for that chairman who allowed me to be. So I think we have to be more bold about bringing people into situations. And that was an hour that had a huge effect for me long-term on conflict, or what happens when people blow up in when it's real, like something bad's going to happen in that way.
An hour that's worth a decade of experience.
Yeah, it's a better way of putting it. Yeah.
Sorry, we have to end the session. I would like to say big words of thanks for Dominic, and we're gonna have a mingling session in the back, so you will have some opportunities to come up to Dominic and ask him some more questions. Before that, I would like to say again thank you to Shaul. Where's Hanoch? I'm not saying Hanoch. Also, thank you to Hanoch, and also to Niva and to Tovit and Nitzan and Roni and Nivin, who's not here right now. So I would actually like to ask the team to come up if we can get a picture with you, and then we'll meet at the back for coffee.